Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. Quick announcement up top. We've launched a second channel called Poker Room Review. It reviews live poker rooms all across the world. Very different to this channel, of course, but if you're interested in poker, link in description. However, today we're going to talk about the world's richest man, Elon Musk, and have an in-depth discussion about two major events that have occurred in his life in the past 48 hours. The first is he made profoundly significant comments on Twitter about the war in Ukraine that were massively ratioed. And second, within 24 hours of this, he confirmed that he is moving ahead with the acquisition of Twitter at the cost of some 44 billion US dollars, 54 US dollars a share, significantly higher than it's currently valued on the share market. So join with me as I explore in detail what I think happened for Elon, his inner circle, and how he arrived at this juncture and the importance of it for us moving forward. Elon, I think, is one of the most interesting characters out there, particularly in that top billionaire class, because he's not just some wealthy man, he is also widely admired for different reasons among different people. First of all, his engineering skills, his ability and willingness to challenge complex engineering problems, to commercialize that and to turn those into useful value-adding products. He's admired for his spacefaring endeavors, his goal of making humanity an interplanetary species to drive the human race forward into the new frontiers. And he has a massive amount of social power. He has a huge cult following. He's able to move markets by himself. If we think back to the GameSpot shorting incident where he took on Wall Street by himself because everyone bought GameSpot stock at a time when Wall Street had shorted it. But his most significant influence relates to his politics. He has more money than God and is totally uncancelable, and yet by himself is able to stand up to Silicon Valley, Washington insiders, and in the most ironic sense, despite being this Gen X engineering nerd, gives a voice to ordinary working class Americans who are concerned about things like cancel culture and political correctness. And he pushes back against all of those things in the most forceful and, I have to say, fairly effective way. And it was this liberal attitude that caused him to want to buy Twitter in the first place. The precipitating incident was the banning from the Twitter platform of the Babylon Bee. It's a conservative, satirical news website that basically makes jokes like The Onion, but from a right-wing point of view. And Twitter knocked them off completely. Now, this follows, of course, a string of high-profile bannings, all from one side of the political aisle. The most significant, of course, being a sitting US president, but also the most nefarious case was the absolute censoring of a true news story before the last election published by one of the oldest newspapers in America that was damaging to Biden's campaign. The FBI claimed that this was Russian disinformation, which Twitter and others knew to be false, and yet they used that to block the sharing of this story anyway to help one political candidate. And however you personally feel about the candidates in that election, I think it's totally inappropriate that Twitter, which purports to be a platform for people to broadcast and break news, actively editorialized in order to assist one political candidate because of damaging information that the public were prevented from knowing and making up their own minds, which is what the democracy is about and what journalism is for. So it was all this that caused Elon to resolve to buy Twitter and allow all the banned individuals and companies back on the platform, verify everyone who could be personally identified, and turn Twitter into the new public square where no one could be censored. That is, recognizing that Twitter is a place where democracy happens, and that, according to Musk's philosophy, it's simply inappropriate for any reason to suppress freedom of speech, which performs a important social function. So in summary, Musk's decision to purchase Twitter was ideological. It's not because he saw the company as extremely good value for money, although he will try and make it more profitable. It wasn't because he was trying to solve a technological problem that was facing humanity, but rather to preserve what he sees as a fundamental tenet of a well-functioning democracy, that being the ability to freely express one's ideas and have those ideas challenged in an open marketplace. But some, and I stress some, not all, of Musk's inner circle pushed back on this. They saw this as commercially disastrous. Buying Twitter, not only was this a huge cost that was hard to justify on the fundamentals of the company, but also would have a significant impact on Musk's other companies such as Tesla, because the founding CEO would have their attention distracted across multiple different industries, different companies, and the Tesla stock reflected that. The market then also moved against Twitter in many respects, devaluing the company in such a way that Musk's purchase seemed more and more like a white elephant. And eventually, he clearly was brought around to the idea that he had acted too rashly and that buying Twitter was fundamentally a commercial mistake. Elon then looked around for ways of backing out of the deal. This became evident to Twitter, who saw him as stalling and sued Elon Musk to force him to proceed with the acquisition. Now, here's the first point where I'm going to discuss something that isn't widely understood. It's not a secret, but most people don't really know about it. And that is Elon, while he publicly claimed that the reason he was backing out of the deal was that Twitter, he alleged, was lying on its FEC filings about the number of bots, that Twitter had said that fewer than 5% of accounts were automated bots. And Elon claimed that this was significantly higher and therefore impacted the overall value of the company because it spoke to the number of active users. Well, this wasn't what the case was about. And his lawyers never made that claim because, in fact, the claim that Twitter was essentially lying about its company fundamentals were easily disproven and a total non-starter under the acquisition laws in the American jurisdiction where the case was filed. Instead, what Musk's lawyers argued was that Twitter was too slow in responding to Musk's lawful due diligence request for information. So Elon is entitled, when he's acquiring the company, to get all kinds of information about the operation of the business that, in good faith, would allow him to more accurately know how things work and what changes might be needed once he takes over the operation. Now, Twitter denied that it was slow walking any of these responses and that it was responding to Elon in a timely fashion. However, the questions were becoming increasingly obscure, which Twitter alleged was a deliberate attempt by Elon to string things out so that he could renege on the deal. Moreover, Twitter was alleging that Elon was using the privileged information he was receiving as part of this agreement to drive down the value of Twitter by attacking it publicly on its own platform, for example, with the numbers of bots. Now, frankly, this is absolutely true. And so the general consensus among acquisition legal specialists seemed to be that Elon, despite all the public rhetoric and the people on YouTube, sort of talking heads about it, that Elon legally didn't have much of a leg to stand on. And the real question wasn't whether Twitter would be in trouble for its FEC filings, and instead, if Elon would be A, forced to acquire the company under the original deal, B, have a much more inflated breakup fee. So there was a $1 billion breakup fee in the contract, and this was likely to be substantially larger if awarded by the courts, given what had brought us to this point. Or 3, some private arrangement between the board of Twitter and Elon to settle the matter away from the court's jurisdiction. Any of those were likely outcomes. What wasn't a likely outcome was Elon winning this case because he had signed this agreement. This agreement had all the normal provisions, and Elon's claims were a bit strange, particularly since cleaning up the bots was one of the things that he had said he intended to do by acquiring Twitter in the first place. Now, personally, and this is just my opinion, I think that Elon's strategy to date was to drag things out, to make the legal case as painful as possible, to force the board to come to some kind of negotiating position, perhaps allow Elon to acquire Twitter at a slightly cheaper price, something like that, so both sides could come away with a facade of a win. However, in the last few days, something dramatic happened to change Elon's mind and to seal this deal on Twitter's original terms. And that, of course, was his comments about Ukraine. Okay, so I'll start with this first tweet, which is really what brought the ball rolling. You'll see on the screen how I voted. It says, Ukraine-Russia peace. Redo elections of annexed regions under UN supervision. Russia leaves if that is the will of the people. Crimea, formerly part of Russia, as it has been since 1783 until Khrushchev's mistake. Water supply to Crimea assured. Ukraine remains neutral. So there are two parts of this that I think are Kremlin talking points, and this is probably the most damaging for Elon himself. One is to do with the history, that Crimea has been part of Russia since 1783. It's really Russia, and that it was just a mistake of the Soviets that changed all this. It completely runs roughshod over a lot of other history, not least of which the fact that Ukraine, in its current borders, including Crimea, was internationally recognized by all countries, including Russia, since 1991. So Elon is essentially adopting a historical revisionism adopted by the Kremlin itself. And then Ukraine remains neutral was a Kremlin demand. Every country has the right to align itself and determine its relationships with other countries as part of its own national sovereignty. That is not a deal that can be imposed upon Ukraine by any other country, least of all by Russia and least of all by force of arms. But at the core of the proposal is this idea of a referendum, and that is to redo the elections to determine the future of Crimea and the Donbass, whether or not they should remain as part of Ukraine or absorbed into the Russian Federation, and that these elections would be done by the United Nations under international observation and auspices. Now, this idea is not new. In fact, I would have potentially supported this prior to 2014, because back then it was well known that Crimea had a lot of Russian speakers. Russia's presence in Crimea was, of course, significant. They had a massive military base in Sevastopol, for example. And there was an open question whether or not there were tensions brewing between those Russian speakers in the east and the Ukrainian nationalists in the west, and whether or not some kind of referendum on among perhaps all of Ukraine or perhaps just these regions, but under international observation, could be useful in crafting a harmonious way forward for this region among all the different players. That all went right off the table when Russia legally moved in and annexed the territory by force and then put up a sham referendum, and since then has performed all kinds of ethnic cleansing to make sure that that region becomes firmly under Russian control. So the most polite thing you could say about this suggestion of a UN kind of referendum in Crimea is that it is not credible. There is no way that Russia is going to allow truly international observers to, in a completely unmolested way, run a referendum in Crimea. And whatever the result is by either side, it's going to be considered as totally illegitimate. So the nicest thing I could say about this is it is completely naive and goes against the reality on the ground. The reality is that Crimea, the Donbass, was part of Ukraine, is part of Ukraine, and should be reabsorbed into a unified Ukraine once the Ukrainians have driven the Russians out. Now, after that, what should happen with those regions is another question. We can have that discussion once the war is over as to the future of the people in the region. How do we make sure that they are enfranchised either in a national unified Ukrainian government or, assisted to leave if that's what they choose to do, if they're worried about reprisal or whatever. That's another question. But we're talking about a reality that is almost a decade late. This idea of a UN referendum may have had merit back before Russia unilaterally tried to redraw the map of Europe. And Ukraine is simply fighting for its national territory, its national survival, and has every right to demand that the Russians leave and push them out by force if necessary. So before I read on, you can see that Elon's own poll has gone against him, which is exceptionally rare for someone as popular as Elon. But not only that, it has been ratioed. There are 114,000 replies to roughly 89,000 likes. The popular opinion on Twitter is firmly against Elon, even though Elon was talking primarily to his own followers. And then it goes on, it says, this is highly likely to be the outcome in the end, just a question of how many die before then. I presume he put this reply to his own poll up when he saw the no votes getting a lot of traction. And this has a lot of problems, both in terms of values and analysis. In terms of values, it's really up to the Ukrainians as to how much punishment, how much suffering they're willing to endure for the sake of their own national identity and national struggle of territory. That is entirely a matter for them to determine. And if they think it's worth sacrificing for, they will do so. They will, die for the cause and give up for something bigger than themselves. And that's what makes them heroes. And that's what's made them successful. Their extremely high morale, their willingness to incur huge risks for what they believe is a just cause and a just war. So it's not really for Elon to say, lots of people are going to die and therefore it's not worthwhile. Yes, lots of people die in war. Yes, there are a huge price to be paid. It's a really tragic thing that this is happening on a totally human level. Feeling compassion is absolutely essential and normal. But whether or not it is worth that death and suffering, that's not for Elon to determine. That's a matter for the Ukrainians. And if they want to continue the fight, then our job is to back them because they do have an absolutely justified goal. And then in terms of analysis, he says this is highly likely to be the outcome. I don't think it's likely at all. There is no chance that the UN are going to come in and do referendums in Crimea or Donbass. So that's not going to happen. There is no possibility that Ukraine is going to remain neutral. It will firmly be aligned with the West, the EU, and NATO for the foreseeable future. Russia does not have the power to enforce that neutrality on Ukraine. Any opportunity there was for the Kremlin to get that kind of outcome, to turn Ukraine into a sort of neutral buffer state, that is now over. And we've seen Sweden and Finland join NATO formally. It's only a matter of time that Ukraine does the same. So I just don't know where Elon is getting this rather absurd idea. And then his third point is, I think, what's really playing on his mind, which is also worth noting that a possible, albeit unlikely, outcome from this conflict is nuclear war. Now, there are those that may know I am a nuclear weapons specialist. That is my background, and specializing in particular Russia's nuclear strategy and doctrine and capabilities. I will do a lecture on the nuclear issue and how it relates to the region at some point. I'll put it in my lecture series. I think it is worthy of detailed analysis, so I won't go into it here. Suffice to say that if nuclear use did occur, and I don't think it's likely, but if it did occur, that would be Russia doing it. It's only Russia that would consider the use of nuclear weapons. The decision would be made by Putin himself, and that would have massive and terrible consequences for Russia and for Putin as an individual. The moral, strategic, human, historical consequences of any such decision of nuclear use for any reason in this conflict is firmly on the shoulders of Vladimir Putin. So if Elon is worried about nuclear war, well, that wouldn't come from a vacuum. That would come from an active decision made by the brutal dictator who has unleashed it. I think there is a viewpoint within Elon's kind of personal echo chamber, his inner circle, that Twitter is driving conversation that is going to end in World War III, that we're being too cavalier about the risk of nuclear weapons. All I'd say to that is that's not the way the Kremlin operates. They're not in that same echo chamber. They have a different view on these things, and I'll discuss it in my lecture series. But the point is, if nuclear use did occur, well, we shouldn't be paying a Danegeld to prevent that. We're not Ethelred the Unready. We are a serious force, the West, with our own military capabilities. And if Russia wants to escalate, that would be a tragedy, a real mistake, but not one that we should back down out of fear. So Elon's interjection here, I think, is misguided. We shouldn't be paying Danegeld. You never get rid of the Dane. And with the nuclear question, that's where I can be most generous with Elon's remarks, that they're clearly made in good faith. he psychologically is a bit preoccupied with the ending of the human race. He talks about artificial intelligence. That's what's driving his move towards making humanity an interplanetary species, because he thinks that's the essential ingredient to human survival, that we should increase population, various other things. So he is concerned about the security of the human race as a species, and recognizes correctly, of course, that nuclear weapons pose a outsized risk to the preservation of that species, that we have absolutely the ability to annihilate the human race in a day should we decide to do so using these weapons. And I'll again talk about that more in my lecture. However, his advice and concern, while in good faith and legitimate, is incorrect in terms of its analysis, in my view. And that just because Russia has the nuclear button and is willing to kind of show that it has it, doesn't mean that we should acquiesce to Russian demands or terminate hostilities on conditions that are suitable for Russia just because of that fact. In fact, we cause ourselves significantly more headaches down the line if we do so. And I'll explain why also again later. Okay, so many responses to these comments, obviously, but I'll just point to one by Paul Massaro. It says, Ukraine-Russia peace. Ukraine liberates all its sovereign territory. Russia decolonizes, demilitarizes, and denuclearizes. And that has more than double the likes of Elon's own remarks. This guy who, he's a verified account, and I've followed his work because he's done a lot of good reporting on Ukraine over many months. But compared to Elon Musk, I mean, he's a nobody, and yet he's got an overwhelming response showing that Elon is totally in the wrong camp when it comes to public opinion about this subject. So seeing the way the wind had blown on his original comments, Elon doubled down using a tactic of sophistry, which is basically to pick something a priori, which isn't actually related to what was proposed, and then claim this basic values tenet proves his original remarks. And I'll point it out. It says, let's try this then. The will of the people who live in the Donbass and Crimea should decide whether they're part of Russia or Ukraine. In other words, he's saying that this is a matter of self-determination, as if there wasn't an illegal invasion of Ukrainian territory, which didn't matter what the self-determination was. This was a decision made unilaterally by the Kremlin. So he's basically saying, if you answer no, well, then you're saying people shouldn't have right to self-determination. And if you answer yes, why are you against the UN coming in and organizing a referendum in Crimea and the Donbass? And the answer to that question is one does not follow the other. Ukraine is fighting for its sovereignty, its survival. And if there is an environment of peace, if there is no conflict, if things are stable, then perhaps down the track, you might organize some kind of peaceful settlement through negotiation that allows the interests of all parties to be satisfied, but not at the barrel of a gun. And what Russia has done since 2014 to militarize, to control, to crack down on dissent in these regions undermines the credibility of any such kind of vote in the first place. To be fair to Elon, he is trying to look at this as an engineer might, with utilitarian principles, trying to come up with a solution where everybody wins, where the fighting ceases, where there's peace in the region, and that the war ends in a way that everybody lives. And I think that there is a long way between the claim about the self-determination of the people of this region after 10 years of occupation and Ukraine being a neutral country unable to determine its own future. Because you can turn this back on Elon and say, well, why should Ukraine be neutral? Shouldn't the people of Ukraine decide what their alliances are? Isn't that fundamental to the self-determination of that country? So again, a priori, it's not a good link, and I do see it as a bit disingenuous, although it is revealing about Elon's actual thought process. Anyway, this got trolled. The Ukrainian president himself puts out a poll and says, which Elon Musk do you like more? One who supports Ukraine, one who supports Russia. 80%, of course, supporting Ukraine, roughly the same amount of votes, 2.4 million, and 250,000 likes. Certainly no ratio on that. So Elon just got absolutely dunked on across the board. There was another one where Garry Kasparov, former chess champion, prominent Putin critic, he criticized Elon for this. Elon replied, "We gave Starlinks to Ukraine and lost 80 million plus in doing so, while putting SpaceX and myself at serious risk of Russian cyber attack. What have you done besides tweet?" Now that last line is a bit gross. I mean, Garry Kasparov is a dissident. He publicly criticized the Putin regime for years. He was a major opposition figure and has now moved abroad for his own safety. So, I mean, that's just a fairly gross remark from Elon. But I can understand that, he's talking about specifically the war in Ukraine and perhaps wasn't thinking about, Kasparov's broader contribution to peace and democracy. And Kasparov actually had a pretty strong... I mean, I have my own qualms with Kasparov, but he responded powerfully. He said, "And I praised you, as did many others, for those acts. But should good deeds purchase immunity for later bad ones, or should every act and statement be judged on its merits? Should Ukrainians who thanked you for Starlink be silent when you spread Kremlin talking points against them?" I think that's a beautiful response. I couldn't put it better myself. And there have been claims whether the US government paid Elon for those units or not. I'm confident that Elon donated Starlink to Ukraine. He did so immediately when asked at the beginning of the hostilities, when it was a full-scale invasion of the Ukrainian territory by Russia. We weren't just talking about a war in the far east of the country. So I think Elon donated those on faith. Whether he got some money back or whatever, I don't know the full details, but I am confident that he was trying to help Ukraine and put himself at risk in doing so. So the actual comment about Starlink is true. He deserves gratitude from Ukraine for that. It has allowed them to continue to access the internet despite Russia's attacks on critical infrastructure, and has helped the Ukrainian war effort. But then there are two more steps where Elon gets off the deep end a little bit and is quite revealing. He responds to a Renata Concoli. It says, "You are assuming that I wish to be popular. I don't care. I do care that millions of people may die needlessly for essentially an identical outcome." Now, this is not true. It's not true. I'm sorry. Elon cares deeply about being popular. He recognizes more so than anybody that it's his cult of personality, the people that are willing to follow him and give his voice a social force, a market force and a social force that has made him such an effective player in the modern world. For example, Jeff Bezos is comparably wealthy to Elon in that he has enough money to do basically anything you can do specifically with money, but not enough money to make people like the Rings of Power or think that Galadriel is a well-written character in his Amazon series. Perhaps nobody has that power, but if anyone did, it would be Elon Musk, because his personal social capital is immense. That is his most valuable asset. And imagine if Elon was generally unpopular, if people across the political spectrum didn't like Elon Musk. Well, life for him would be so much harder, and he wouldn't be able to do even a fraction of the things that he does. So yes, he does care about being popular, and that is just an incorrect statement. Maybe he believes it, but I don't think he does. And then he goes on to say something even nuttier, which is Russia is doing partial mobilization. They go to full war mobilization if Crimea is at risk. Death on both sides will be devastating. Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine, so victory for Ukraine is unlikely in total war. If you care about the people of Ukraine, seek peace. And the best thing I can say about this is it doesn't reveal skilled military analysis of the situation on the ground. Just because Russia has a bigger population doesn't mean that it has the same mobilization potential to defend a place like Crimea. I think there are a lot of complicated reasons as to why that is, but not least of which, just because Crimea is considered an integral part of Russia by the Kremlin doesn't mean people across the board in Russia see it that way. and they would generally blame their own government more than anybody else should Crimea be placed at risk. And so the loss of Crimea, or if Crimea was, say, invaded by Ukrainian forces, Putin would be spending a lot of time trying to shore up his regime rather than being able to bring the full might of Russia to bear on expelling any incursion into Crimea. And even if he did successfully mobilize his national resources for this purpose, which he absolutely would not be able to do, there won't be a mass mobilization of every fighting age male in Moscow and St. Petersburg. That's not going to happen. But if they did, the most likely outcome would be revolution, not, expulsion of the Ukrainians from Crimea. So yeah, it's just an incorrect analysis of the situation, both militarily and strategically and politically, and shows that perhaps Elon has been influenced by people in his inner circle. I won't mention names here, but I think that, it's just a disastrous misreading of the situation. Okay, so to summarize to this point, so far we've got his legal battle with Twitter over the acquisition of the company itself, his massive misstep in commenting on Ukraine in this way and getting hugely ratioed across the board. And then he goes and makes one more mistake, which is he responds to some comments suggesting that the reason why the votes had turned against him on the poll and that he was being ratioed was that it was the biggest bot attack he'd ever seen, that the bot poll was strong. In other words, saying that the people who were anti his position weren't real Twitter users, but actually automated bots. And here he just jumped the shark, because that is plainly not true. It's not true for the vast majority of the people who hitherto supported him but don't agree with him on Ukraine, like myself. And it's also extremely dangerous for his legal case, because no doubt his lawyers said to him in no uncertain terms, stop attacking Twitter on the platform. Stop making any public comments about Twitter and the deal, and let us do the legal case. So he went against that by publishing these comments, and perhaps his own legal team threatened to resign over them. I don't know. This is speculation. This is not me with hard evidence, but certainly they would have told him not to do that, and he did it anyway. And so he might have concluded in that moment, well, the gig is up, I might as well conclude the deal because I'm going to lose anyway. But also, it's a really useful vehicle for regaining the narrative, because he was losing people that had previously supported him over Ukraine. And one of the things they supported him for was the acquisition of Twitter and its restoration in terms of its integrity as a uncensored place for the public square and for democracy. And so by announcing this deal, he, again, reasserts his popularity among his devoted following. People like myself, Konstantin Kisin, many other individuals who are out there on the internet commentating are critical of him on Ukraine, but support him in this. Also, those that hate Elon Musk, despise him for everything he stands for, the kind of left-wing movements in the United States, who also support Ukraine and saw this as a massive mistake that Elon had made, and were dunking on him and kicking him while he was down. And he has responded very quickly to say, well, actually, I'm going to buy Twitter. And now they're the ones caught wrong-footed and reacting to this announcement and allowing Elon to regain control of the narrative. So kind of a masterful stroke in that respect. Hats off to him. He realized that I think he made a lot of enemies with Ukraine, and now this is his way of getting back in the game. I also think that there's a financial incentive to do that, because the Ukraine is something that people would react to so viscerally that it would harm his Tesla sales. People would stop buying Teslas. I saw a lot of memes online about Teslas with a Z on them and all that kind of stuff. It could hurt him economically by having this divisive position. And so by pushing the narrative forward as quickly as possible and making it about freedom of speech and Twitter, he's going to minimize that damage. So even though the Tesla shares took a 9% hit as a consequence of his announcement, I actually think it was quite a good idea to declare that he was buying Twitter immediately. And that way it will minimize the bleeding in that respect. So yes, I will continue to follow Elon and continue to praise him when he does things that I like and criticize things that I don't like. I think this might be healthy for Elon psychologically to recognize that he's not a cult leader, that there are people out there that, yeah, they do support him, but it's usually conditional, and he will hopefully understand that. and that will maybe lead him to make better decisions in the future. I personally don't think his comments on Ukraine are a hangable offense. I think that he made these comments in good faith. He actually genuinely thought he was helping. And although a real mistake, and hopefully one he can show a bit of contrition for in future, I do think there should be a pathway back for Elon, even among those that strongly support Ukraine and were personally affected by his remarks, because there was some seriously powerful rebuttals to this. Certainly the Ukrainian ambassador swore straight up to him on Twitter. But yeah, what did you think of Elon's remarks? Were they correct? Were they totally beyond the pale? Did you like Elon before? Did you hate him before? Has this changed your opinion of him? What about his purchase and acquisition of the company? I think it's just a remarkable moment in the life of a very powerful and influential figure in modern history. Leave your comments down below. I'd love to hear them, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.